All right, so just as a reminder, we're not gonna have a quiz Friday. We're gonna watch a documentary, but I am going to take attendance Friday and Monday. So just so I want to be sure, because there will be a short assignment that is gonna go along with this film. So just please be sure you still come. We are only watching the documentary in class, but there will be things in the film that you need to see and hear to do the assignment. But that is all we're doing Friday month. There is no quiz Friday. They made the announcement about the paper due date being next Friday instead of Monday. Everybody's clear about that? Any questions about the paper at all? And then there will be a quiz next Friday, and some of this week's material will probably appear on next week. So just wanted to this week's readings are sort of all connected. Well, we're talking about communication, but kind of thinking about like we've got I guess like the question really is like there's so much noise here that might be out of their control and out of their control that something gets lost from here to here because there's so much noise by, for example, as I discussed on Monday, groups that are intentionally trying to confuse the public about what the scientists have said. You've got entire industries, you're going to see this in the documentary. You have entire industries who exist, whose purpose is to try to sow doubt in the public's mind. I'm not saying you don't know this, given what we've been living through, but it still kind of really makes this job that much harder. Like how should they attempt to communicate given the noise? Does that mean that there should be extra obligations here because of this, or would that not be fair to say that there should be extra obligations? And this was, I think, to some extent what came up towards the end of class on Monday was, there seemed to be this idea that no, there really should be no extra obligations because at the end of the day, the public might have certain values, but ultimately, if the public decides to ignore the science, ultimately they're just kind of selfish and kind of, well, I'm not necessarily attributing this view to anyone in particular, but it certainly seemed to be an implication of what some of you were saying, is that they're selfish and they're dumb. And so, there's really no extra obligation here to incorporate. In other words, there's no extra obligation for scientists to incorporate values into their communication. Because at the end of the day, the public's going to do what they're going to do. Now, one additional thing to point out, and this was brought up to me, that doesn't mean, though, that there couldn't be strategies other than incorporating values. This was what was shown in the film. One strategy you could attempt to come up with, right, is to find someone who, in other words, let's say the issue, just say the issue is climate change. Let's say that's the issue, and the public doesn't want to listen to the science on climate change because it means that they're going to have to alter their lifestyle in some way. they're gonna have to maybe drive less or fly less or whatever the case might be, maybe eat healthier, I don't know, whatever lifestyle choices might be required to reduce like your carbon footprint, so to speak. And somebody could see that and say that, I don't want to do that because that would involve the government, overstepping control. But if you find, right, a voice who's able to speak, so in other words, if you find a voice from within their own community who's able to speak to them, then that might be one really promising way to try to kind of get them to go along, because you found someone who they are not automatically going to not listen to, but they're going to be more willing to listen. So anyways, that was just by way of review. But today's reading is related to this same topic, although again, I know I asked you to read from a different text for today, but it's still in the same general vicinity. And part of what's brought up in the reading is a kind of attempt to give a name to this. Let me raise. What am I getting? In other words, the view that the public is simply ignorant. I'm going to put ignorant here as another. The view that the public is simply ignorant, and that if the scientists simply give them the right information, they will sort of come along. In other words, just give them more science. Give them more facts, give them more statistics, and eventually they will sort of overcome their ignorance and come along to understand that, of course, the science must be true. I just needed more facts and statistics to understand it. There's a model for that way of thinking about communication. Does anyone know what that meant in the reading? In other words, the public simply lacks information. And by giving them information, they will come to understand what the scientists are saying. There's a way of conceptualizing the relationship between scientists and the public there. It's called the deficit model. Anyone? That sound familiar? Anyone? In other words, what this is saying, this is simply saying that right, deficit simply means lack. The public is ignorant. They lack the right information. If you give them the right information, they will probably agree. And I think, in other words, what the author of the reading is pointing out is that is a very oversimplified view of why the public is resistant to trusting science. They're not resistant to trusting science simply because they lack information. And Monday's discussion should have alluded to what? The reasons that they're rejecting science have to do more with their values. Does that make sense? Does this make sense what this model is attempting to say? It's trying to explain why the public is resistant, and it focuses on lacking information. And what the author is trying to point out is that if that's the model we use, then we are likely to never really convince the public, the skeptical public, not the, when I say the public, I mean those who are skeptical of certain science, truths, scientific. If we use that as the model, the deficit model, we'll never convince them. Because we'll just assume that the reason they distrust science is because they lack scientific understanding. And that if you just give them more facts, give them more information, they will just come along. So she's trying to, the author of the piece is trying to suggest that this way is kind of, it's flawed. I don't know, do you think that is that how, like, maybe you wouldn't, would you have used that as an explanation for why the public distrusts science? You would. Go ahead. You guys can try to talk at the same time.
I think some people definitely reject it because they don't fully understand it. Like maybe it's like background knowledge they're missing or something, more than just like more information on that one topic. But certainly like the values and stuff, like that makes a lot more sense to me. That's why someone would be unwilling to get it even if they do have all the information.
Okay. Yes, and the last thing you said is true, is because, yeah, I mean, no matter the amount of information you give them, they will still not. But, and that seems to point to the fact that this model is flawed, because you've tried to give them the information, and they still.
They also like account for the fact that they've grown up with these values, so they're more solidified. And then when they receive information that's like brand new to them, it's like this, like falling back on those foundational values that they hold and have like been raised on. That's like more to that probably more promising than just this new fact. And also I feel like in today's time, you can look up a lot of stuff if you wanted to. And so like in a way, if they really didn't have the information, they could do something about it if they believe.
That's true, that's true, that's true. Yeah, so I like the, no, the first thing you said makes sense. I mean, I think ultimately you're just saying people are more likely to filter new information through their existing biases. Any new information that comes their way will automatically be filtered through a particular frame. And everything gets passed through that frame. And so instead of just being neutral scientific information, it gets passed through a certain frame. Yeah, I think that's right. So anyways, I guess what this is just trying to show is that scientific communication is really complicated. It's not just a matter of passing information from an expert into an empty vessel, right? It means that the job of scientific communication is a lot more complicated than maybe we think it is. And so this reading then raises a question about different kinds of communication that we might engage in to try to maybe overcome this problem. There's a distinction made in the reading between two different kinds of communication. Yeah.
Strategic and
Yeah, good. So the author, I think her name is Priest. I'm just going to refer to her by name sometimes. Actually, on that point, sometimes it's funny to me that sometimes you guys in your writing, you will refer to authors by their first names. So you end up just calling them like Suzanne in the paper. And it's like, oh, I didn't know you knew Susanna Priest. So you just call her Susanna instead. Anyways, it's sort of a funny thing that sometimes happens in student writing where you, instead of maybe you'll be writing about Michael Sandel and you just call it Michael. You know, it's just, unless you know Michael Sandel, it'd be kind of weird to call him by his first name, at least in formal writing. That distinction is sort of, she's just trying to think about, well, when would it be okay to use this kind of communication? Because she thinks ultimately this is what we like to think we should strive for. Why? Why does this one seem better than this one? At least on the surface. Go ahead.
Because it kind of gives people like their own choice. It's not forcing you to do something.
Right. So democratic communication attempts to, give the person a decision in whether they take action. You give them information, and they say, I'm not sure what I want to do with this. And so that's, in other words, democratic communication respects autonomy, which is a very important, usually in any discussion about ethics. This is a very important topic. It's always an important topic. You remember it from the case studies we did about medical ethics. Respecting autonomy, giving somebody the choice is what, at least a lot of the time, we want to be able to respect a person's autonomy. Whereas strategic, well, strategic means that, at least on the surface, strategic might violate autonomy. It might, doesn't have to. It seems like it might. Because strategic communication involves the attempt not to allow somebody to make their own decision, but trying to get them to do something that you want them to do. That's what strategic communication is. You don't have the neutral goal. When you engage in strategic communication, you don't have some neutral goal of here's some information. It's here's some information and I want you to do this. Does that make sense? So it doesn't mean that strategic communication can't be used, but it probably needs to be justified. If you're going to use it, it probably needs to be justified. Because, yeah, autonomy matters. So the question though is, well, I'm just gonna, do you think that, let's just ask it this way. Do you think that scientists, when they're attempting to communicate with the public, should try to use strategic communication? Or should they only? No. Is it appropriate to use strategic communication? I guess it's maybe a very broad question. Maybe it depends on the example, the context. You think that scientists should attempt to not only give somebody information, but also say, do this with it? Is that problematic? Does that violate autonomy, or is autonomy not really? Maybe autonomy doesn't matter. Yeah.
It seems that, well, on the surface, it looks like it would violate autonomy. We've seen clearly that even if the scientist does push a certain agenda, people are still just going to ignore that agenda a decent amount. So even if they try and push a certain agenda with strategic communication, it still is up to the person whether or not they listen.
So, yeah, okay, so it might violate autonomy, but, or it actually doesn't. In other words, you're saying it seems like it could violate autonomy, but still, at the end of the day, the person can still make that decision. Okay. Anyone else? Thoughts about, that makes sense.
I feel like it's kind of difficult because some people get information and then they're kind of like, well, what do I do with this?
Yeah.
So in a way, it seems like strategic kind of helps in the sense that they're giving a solution, but it's a solution that they want.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Democratic, at least the way the Democratic is being framed is, yeah, I mean, in the context of particular examples, and this was something that came up before, how often is it that the goal is as neutral as just giving information? Not usually, I mean, there might be some examples where it is, you just want to educate, for example. If the goal is just to educate, I suppose that's a possibility. But the kinds of examples we're thinking about with things like climate change, of course, and you know, the pandemic and things like that, is of course, it's not just here's some information and do what you want with it, it's here's some information and do this with it. So yeah, so the public just might not understand. And so you've actually raised there's another term in the reading that if this was present, we could use this. She calls it critical science literacy. You know what that, you remember that from the, she's just saying that, I think this, just given what you just said, I mean, I think she's saying that democratic communication assumes that the public actually can understand science. It means that you can give them information and then they can interpret it and like reach the right conclusions about it. And the problem is they can't. Often, I mean, one example I think of the most is when like a scientist changes their mind about something they said. And we saw this a lot with Nicholas. They said something, but the science changed. Now, from a public's perspective, when they see that, they think, oh, the sneaky scientist is changing their mind and they're trying to control me. When in reality, new evidence has emerged that forced them to go back and revisit their hypothesis or something, right? And that's a basic activity of science, right? New evidence forces you to revise some things that you originally thought were true. Is that right? So that's the basic scientific method. So when the scientist does that, they're just doing science. They're following what the evidence forced them to do. But again, from the public's perspective, they see that and think, oh, you were lying to me before. What you said yesterday was a lie, and now, so what am I supposed to believe? So I think that's just like one really sort of easy example of why. In other words, critical science literacy is not just like, you know, well, I don't know, what do you think she means by critical science? Science literacy is one thing, right? Science literacy is, why should you put the label critical? Because like science literacy could just be, I don't know, what? Understanding how, what's a basic scientific concept? I don't know why I'm like losing. What's that?
Water cycle.
Yeah, okay, water cycle. Okay, so you just understanding how the water cycle works. Understanding what, okay, when it rains, what's happening? How does that work? Okay, photosynthesis maybe too. Maybe that's another one. Is that all she needs? But why is that? I mean, that's science literacy, you can say. That's not critical. Go ahead.
I mean, it kind of like brings me to think about like critical thinking, where it's not just like, oh, you're reading something and like you're understanding what like the words mean, I guess, verbatim, but like you actually have to think about like
Okay.
what it actually means and like what to do with that information.
Jared, what do you think separates science from critical?
I was basically gonna say the same thing of, it goes from being, I know these facts about the water cycle, for example, to I can think about those and understand what they mean beyond just the presented information.
So it's being able to apply it in some way, being able to maybe take some kind of action based upon it. Okay. Yeah. And I think all she's saying in this reading is that the very low levels of this in society necessitate this. In other words, if we had more of this, we could rely on this. But because we don't, we end up having to rely on this instead. And a byproduct of that, unfortunately, is that because we have to rely on this, I think it lowers the trust. The trust is lowered because we end up having to rely on this. But in fact, the only reason we have to rely on this is because we lack this. But is that the public's fault? Is it their fault that they lack critical science literacy? Is that too high of a bar to demand of the public? Is it the average Joe's fault that he doesn't understand how to apply the water cycle? I don't know. Like, should we hold them responsible for? In other words, similar to what you said before, you said, well, if the average, like, we have access to information now, right? We've got access to the internet. If you want to educate yourself about a topic, you can. Is that a possible response here? Go ahead.
Kind of. I mean, you have to like want to
One.
learn to do it. But I do feel like at least in like the like middle school, high school, like I feel like at a certain level, like we are kind of taught to do that. So like
Yeah.
if assuming everyone goes through at least middle school, high school, like we've all been exposed and taught how to like critically think about things. So I guess you still have to put in the effort a little bit.
Okay. You have a lot of faith in the public.
Yeah.
What do you guys think? No, it's fine, I mean, I take your point, I mean, of course,
I mean, I know they're not.
no, I mean, I think for like certain, like, it's gonna, like, generationally, it's gonna differ, of course, right? I mean, it wasn't uncommon, for example, for parents' generation, I mean, I don't know your parents' generation, but my parents' generation, to not even have high school. So that, can we blame them for that? I don't know, I'm just trying to think here about like, is it too high of a bar to expect the public to have scientific literacy and to be able to understand and interpret scientific information without the proper training to do so? Go ahead.
I would say no, but I also just think that as the public, if they lack critical scientific literacy, they should listen then, because not be getting at the fact that they don't know enough to make these decisions on their own. So then if we can't hold them accountable, we can only hold them accountable to do what is being asked of them. That way.
Yeah, it does. I guess the concern is that what's being asked of them seems to run counter to like the way that they live their daily lives. Again, I understand the impulse to want to say they're just being selfish. But I don't think it's always that simple. I think that when people feel like they're being told to change daily life. Again, the pandemic is sort of the exception. Like, I know we think of the pandemic, and I think the pandemic is the exception to the rule. The pandemic necessitates a change in life because of how immediate and urgent it was. And that's why it was so immediate and so urgent, and it still to some extent is. But other things are not as obviously immediate and urgent that we have to put on a mask so we don't breathe on something, right? There's going to be other things that people are asked to do. I don't know, I'm just trying to sort of problematize this a little bit and say it's not as super, because what you, at least to some extent, what some of you seem to be, you just seem to be falling back on this model. You just seem to be saying, well, they're dumb and they should listen. I'm not saying that's exactly what you're saying, but I mean, to some extent, it sounds that. I just think it's more complicated, that's all.
I feel like it's just difficult because if you expected everybody to have like that critical science literacy, it would kind of, you'd have to start from the schools and
Yeah.
put more emphasis on science. And some kids just aren't as interested in science, and like then you'd have to change to like, universities and make like kids who aren't majoring in science have an emphasis on science, and some people just still won't pay attention.
No, I agree. I agree. I understand what you're saying. It's a very complicated goal to increase scientific literacy. And I also think like the reactions some of you are having are totally understandable. I have those reactions too. To when the public seems to not want to do something very simple that science is asking them to do. I have the same reaction. Should this, so you're saying it's complicated, but like, I don't know, like, should this be a goal that we should have? Should we be trying to raise society's level of science literacy? Should we be trying to do that actively? Is that like, should that be a shared goal? I don't know. I mean, the education system is obviously one way to do it. I'm trying to think of other ways. I don't know what other ways are. I don't know. You know, obviously, just a basic science education that you get K through 12 is obviously one way to do that. I understand. But what about somebody who's 50 and doesn't have a K through 12 education? What do we do with that? Do we just call them dumb and selfish and put them in the corner? I don't know. I'm just trying to I'm not saying I have the answers. I'm just asking if you think you. Go ahead.
For me, it's like if you don't have like the education, then I don't see like why you shouldn't just like believe other people who have had the education and trying to explain what's happening. It just makes no sense to me.
Can you see how that might sound to somebody
like, yeah, it definitely sounds like arrogant and conceited for sure,
Yeah,
but I don't know, it's like,
But do we not do that every day in school?
well,
We listen to someone who knows more than we do.
right now I'm asking you what you think.
I don't know.
I think the goal of at least doing it in here should be more, somebody said this, unless this. I'm not trying to get you to do anything. I'm trying to give you information so you can form your own. To an extent, obviously I'm gonna give you a quiz, stuff like that, right? You can't sort of disentangle the grade incentive from this whole structure, but I mean, go ahead.
I do think though that this class is a little bit, the subject of philosophy is a little bit more open
Yeah.
to conversation
It is.
and banter back
It
and
is.
forth.
It is.
Whereas like a lot of classes, especially like in STEM,
Yeah.
are lectures where you sit there and
Yeah.
you take notes and listen to someone who does know more than you.
Yeah.
So I don't know, it just, I kind of agree with him.
The nature of the subject matter will certainly dictate how the communication is done. Yeah, I know, I totally agree. But outside of the educational context though, right? This is a formal structure, we're in a classroom, you come in, it's having those expectations. That's the expectation. You come in here and you, not necessarily here, but as you said, other science classes, you have the expectation that the person is the expert and they're giving the information. But like outside of this context, the average person who's 50 and lacks a high school education, if they're told the scientist just knows better, trust them. They're not likely gonna be like, oh, okay. They're gonna be like, don't tell me what to do.
Yeah.
But
I do like calls for COVID vaccine outreach sometimes, like when I'm calling older people, where like, of course, I first have to do, are you interested in speaking? A lot of times, like, they're just like, I don't believe. And it's kind of like, well, they come from a mindset of like, they think they know more than you know sometimes. So they think they know something about the vaccine that you just don't know, when really their information that they know is incorrect.
and that's right. Remember all the noise?
Yeah.
And that's why, like, no, that makes sense. People think they know more than they know. Vaccines cause blank. And they think they know that because they saw a Facebook post, they saw something, right? But I guess that, like, okay, so now, like, to what extent can we hold the public responsible for lacking the right information when we have entire industries devoted to using it? Should we hold them responsible when we have an entire industry that exists to try to confuse them?
I just think I'm a little bit confused. I guess I think it's not as simple as like when the pandemic first started. I honestly didn't think the first month that it came out and we were just hearing from scientists, I didn't think that it was going to be this big of a deal.
Mhm.
And then I heard family physicians like talk about this, and then people I trusted, and I knew they knew more than me, but it's the fact that I trusted them, they were more personal to me, and they were using the strategic method. So
Okay.
I feel like maybe that noise, that's those squiggles right there,
Yeah,
it really largely depends on. I don't really necessarily think the public should be held more responsible, but I don't think the scientists should be using. I don't think it's the scientist's job to be using the strategic model. I think it's fine for like your physicians,
all right. Aren't they scientists?
but they're not. I think there's a difference between.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. But like a public health official, should a public health official who comes out and communicates, should they be using strategic communication?
They can, but I don't think the public is at fault when they don't necessarily believe.
So you don't think the public is at fault when they don't believe,
I understand where they're coming from.
when they don't?
Yes.
Okay, you understand where they're coming. You don't know if you approve of it, but you understand where they're coming. All right. No, I mean, that makes sense. They can't be blamed. Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, you're gonna see, when we watch this video, I think it's gonna surprise you the extent to which you're gonna be, I don't know if you're gonna be shocked, maybe you're not, maybe you're just numb to all this by now, but like, you will see whose job it is to confuse people. That's why they get paid. That's why they get paid money. They get trained in advertising and marketing to confuse people. That's why they exist. That's why they get paid. Industries exist to make money off of this. And I guess I'm just, yeah, like, does that change your opinion at all about whether the public should be like blamed? Go ahead.
I definitely can understand why people would, be reticent to believe certain things, especially given the noise. But I think this reminds me of when I was younger. I heard a description of the difference between like complaining and like raising an issue. And that's with complaining, you're just saying there's a problem and doing nothing past that. With raising an issue, you present the issue and then try and put an effort to find a solution to it. So I think the responsibility for the public lies in having a desire to improve their critical science literacy, whether or not they necessarily have the ability to actually do so. Because if they're just going to say, I don't trust you, I need to see the science myself or
Yeah.
whatever their reason is, but don't actually try and improve their critical science literacy, then that really would go back to the being selfish and
No.
foolish and that sort of thing, as opposed to if they genuinely want to.
All right.
And then, as we've said, probably have the ability to some extent find that out for themselves.
So there's got to be a desire there. They have to, okay. No, that seems reasonable. Maybe they can't entirely be blamed. But if they're presented with something that says, hey, that shit you read that your great aunt posted on Facebook isn't true, how do they react? Do they get angry and say, no, it's true? Or do they try to think, oh, I'm gonna go find something else to see if it was true? So there's got to be this, okay. That seems like a reasonable thing to say, is that there has to be a desire to learn. Okay. I can agree with that. Go ahead.
I mean, I think it all kind of goes back to like the critical science literacy, like you have to be able to realize like the source that it's coming from. Like we were just saying, like you have to be able to read something and be like, is this a credible source? And like look back and be like, who's funding this research? Like, is it someone who's gonna want to do like, but like that comes with like actually wanting to like figure it out, and be knowledgeable about the subject rather than just like reading something and be like, this one.
Right. No, and I think like for some of you, I don't want to take the responsibility off of them. I'm not like, they're not blameless. Or maybe blamed isn't even the right like frame. Blame tends to, blaming is not really helpful because it's very antagonistic. But there's got to be some desire on their part to like seek out other information than what they have access to. Okay. Anyone else? Anyways, I want to think about he gives the example of direct to consumer advertising as a form of strategic communication. Commercials where, I don't know, drugs are advertised. And I think she thinks that these are like democratic in some sense. In other words, the rise of direct to consumer advertising. Sorry, can you not see that? The rise of things like direct to consumer advertising, where now you can be watching football and then one of the commercials is a brain supplement. Is that good democratic communication? Is that a good form of it? You're giving somebody the information and they can kind of decide whether they want to buy your. Now, I guess I know you're like, it might sound strategic because you're trying to get them to buy something. I don't know, what do you think? You think that direct to consumer advertising, what form of communication do you see that?
I think it's more strategic because the companies, like when they do the commercials on TV about like their drug, they're very biased. Like they're always the same. Like they're sad in the beginning, they're happy after they take the drug. So like, they're not gonna like advertise the downsides of the drug, and like, that's why they say it really fast at the end.
That's true.
So like, it's really biased, so it's probably more strategic because they're influencing the way they think.
That's true. I think the thing she points out in the reading, at least, is that we no longer live in a world where doctors make house calls. So this is supposed to be a way of trying to empower the individual in a way, because we no longer have access to doctors and healthcare the way that maybe we used to, or the way we used to think about it. So something like, in other words, the very name itself, direct to consumer, is supposed to empower them. Now, I see what you're saying. It's hard to think about one of these commercials. I'm sure you can just think about what you imagine when I say one of these commercials, and you automatically are suspicious of these big, pharmaceutical companies trying to get you to buy their drugs. But so yeah, so does it seem more strategic then? Is that what the rest of you think, or is it more? Aren't you just getting that information then? I mean, yeah, so you just think the profit motive there is too hard to deny, and that it really is strategic, or is it more? I'm just thinking of the name. It seems like the name implies democratic, but the actual message is not.
I mean, they do give both sides, but because they don't, give them both equally, because they rush over all the side effects. And it's not something you would always need until you hear about it. So I would say it's definitely strategic because they're not gonna tell you not to buy it, they're telling you to buy it. Or consider that one over others. Like ask your doctor for it, because your doctor's not gonna mention it unless you ask for that one specifically for their own gain. So I would say it's 100% strategic.
100%. Is there any aspect of direct-to-consumer advertising that's democratic? Should we not call it direct-to-consumer then? I don't know.
I'd say there definitely is some strategic aspects to it, largely just from the motivation in the first place. But both with like pharmaceutical ads, and then also something that came up with like user end agreements on websites and that sort of thing. Of the really small text, the
Right.
really quick saying of side effects and so on and so forth. You have to consider the logistics of that and like the legal requirements for the person preparing it, because they would legally have to say all these side effects. But I mean, you can see that the list is really, really long, and kind of boring and generally the same. So like, assume they were to actually spend the same amount of time going through side effects and so on and so forth, but that would just be impractical and frankly unpleasant for the person watching TV. So yes, it does make it harder to see the side effects, but it also is a reasonable thing to do from a practical making a commercial standpoint. So it's not necessarily fully strategic.
All right, so you can defend the, all right, go ahead.
But it is a commercial, they don't want to solve the problem, they want you to use their product to solve their problem. Because they don't say, okay, there's these are the options, and by that note, it's like buy ours to solve the problem, they don't give all the facts.
So it seems like the medium automatically raises questions, like the medium of commercial advertising just makes there could be ways to do it. Like, what would that be? How would these companies sell their drugs? How would these companies sell their drugs in a democratic way? I guess that's what I would ask. Does the fact that they're selling something have to mean it's bad? Like, how would you sell a drug in a democratic way? Or are you always just gonna say, no, you're trying to sell me something and therefore it's strategic? I don't know. Jerry,
Yeah,
that's okay, okay. Anyway, go ahead.
I've seen a lot of people come to the pharmacy and they're like, I saw this supplement on TV, do y'all have it? Or there's something like that without much, like just because you saw a commercial on TV, now you're gonna take this medication every day.
So you think that in fact, the commercial has just encouraged them to seek out information from an expert?
Well, it's not that they want more information, it's that the information has been given to them, like this medication will help with this. And then they skip the part where they're getting more information and just decide to take it.
Oh. Okay, so it just depends on really what they're doing. They're just coming to the pharmacy to say, hey, I heard about this drug on TV, can you tell me more about it? Instead of, hey, I heard about this cure for my arthritis, I want this drug. Yeah. So it's more of the latter than the former. Anyways, I don't have a lot more from this reading. I just wanted to get some of this, the difference between these, the difference the relationship between these things. I'll post the quiz topics, the deficit model, just all this jargon from the reading. That's really the stuff, the big important stuff. The rest of it is just more about, I just wanted to think about this and how complicated this problem is. That's really what I was trying to get out. And again, the purpose of showing you the documentary on Friday really is, climate change is going to be highlighted, of course, but I don't know how surprised you're going to be, but I would venture to say you might be a little bit shocked at some of the things you're going to see. And it's a really well done documentary. So I will see you on Friday. I didn't get your email. I'm sorry I didn't respond.
And I also had a question. I started my computer today, and I just wanted to make sure that like I was kind of looking at tracking. Like, do you state like where you do? Because I was trying to read the same paper, and kind of like go off of that, and then I kind of stated like where like
Yeah, I think you're on the right track in question. Yeah, I think
Okay.
we're on the right track. I think just the one thing that I had said is maybe just like a few broad sentences before the in this paper,
okay,
and just kind of say,
just kind of an intro.
just like, what is this topic? Why does it matter? That kind of.
Okay,
Well, you say you're gonna be able to attend on Zoom.
yes.
So if you want to just take, I was gonna say, you don't have to worry about taking a quiz, then you can just take it. As long as you're gonna be, like, you're gonna be able to go.
Yes.
Yes, you can just make a quiz. I mean, you don't have to make a quiz, that's what it is.
Yes. Mhm. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Wow.